And so for our time together, we're going to be talking about some updates on the COVID-19 international pandemic, some of the bills that have already been signed by the governor that will become law in July of 2020. And then there's a really big meeting April 22nd of next week, and we'll go over that. Then we'll get your questions and get your questions answered. And then we have a few announcements. So with the COVID-19 updates, I wanted to make sure that you all had some of the websites that are really important. State agencies give updates, so whether it's the Virginia Department of Education, whether it's transportation, it might be the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. This thing has kind of been an all hands on deck when it comes to the executive branch. And so that virginia.gov is really helpful to seeing where a lot of the updates may be for your specific questions. Then if you are looking for unemployment benefits, vec.virginia.gov is where you want to go. And be mindful. I had a friend that that signed up or tried to enlist to get unemployment earlier in the year and was rejected, but then tried again after the pandemic and was approved. So there may be some I know the 1 week waiting period was relaxed, but there may be some other parts of this that were relaxed that you might be approved for. So you want to go on and try again. And that is the way that you go to get the up to $398 from Virginia unemployment, and then the additional $600 from the federal federal unemployment. And so it's up to $938 for unemployment based on your eligibility and such. And so that's vec.virginia.gov. Then there's some folks that have been laid off that otherwise had their own insurance. And so this may be a new situation where you need health insurance or you need food access, maybe SNAP benefits. So that is commonhelp.virginia.gov. And you can see you might now, the ACA did not open back up for new enrollments, but with our Medicaid expansion, there may be people that are eligible for emergency Medicaid or might newly be eligible for that Medicaid expansion population. So that's commonhelp.virginia.gov. And there also have been some relaxed requirements on the SNAP benefits, trying to make sure that people have food and supplies as they're navigating this new situation. Now, I do want to say state taxes and federal taxes have different due dates and different information. So as of right now, the tax date for the state is still May 1st. You can get an extension individually, but it is not a blanket extension. And so May 1st is still the day that we're encouraging people to file. And then if you need an extension to pay, but we do need as much information as possible if you're able to file, because when we do, we'll talk about this later, but when we're looking at the budget, we need to know, okay, how much money do we think is coming in and not. And then with the federal taxes, that has been pushed back to July 15th. And then you can also go to irs.gov to get information on your stimulus. One of the questions that we've gotten a lot is if you utilized a tax service in order to get your direct deposit sooner, then typically it's their direct deposit information that is on file. So the federal government supposedly is marking that to say, okay, don't send Jane's tax, her stimulus direct deposit to this account because that's a tax service and not her direct account. And then Jane might end up getting a paper check. Or you can go to irs.gov and click on it and you can update your information. If you have not filed taxes in 2018 or 2019, the best advice that they're giving is to go on and file your taxes. That way your information is there and it can help expedite that situation. A lot of good information about the stimulus info, irs.gov. And then we've been updating our site at delegatemarciaprice.com as new information comes in on Verizon Wireless. Centera had new information, and we're also listing the executive orders so that you can see not just the reporting on them, but the actual dates. There have been some situations that were, I guess, interpreted by other people, but you can look at the words yourself and see what those executive orders state. So that is information on COVID-19. And then as we move forward to talking about the bills, if you go to lis.virginia spelled out.gov, that is really the most important website that you can use to look up some of these bills that we're talking about, because I'm going to say this a lot. It's super important to read the bill. The bill and the legislation, that is where you can get a lot of your questions answered, because even about how I may feel about something, those words are really what you want to look at. So when you get to that site, the first choice that you have in the list is bills and resolutions. You click on that. You can look at all the legislation that was passed. You can even look up all the legislation that have been put forward, but more specifically, you can look at the bills under, it says governor. If it says approved or enacted, those are the bills that will become law on their enactment date. Now, there are 3 different types of enactment dates. 4 different types of enactment dates. There might be a bill that doesn't say a date at the bottom at all. That means once it's signed, it will go into effect July 1st, and that's most of the bills. Then there is an emergency clause. If it says that this bill shall go into effect on, April 30th, once the governor signs it, then that's an emergency clause. That means it can go into effect sooner than July 1st. Then there's a delayed enactment clause, which is on some of the voting bills. So say, for instance, we thought it was a really great idea, but the entity that's putting it together needed a little bit more time in order to implement it. We might do a delayed enactment clause. And so that means that it will not necessarily become law on July 1st. It becomes law on the day that it states in the legislation. Then there's a 4th one, and that is a reenactment clause, and that means it passed the House, the Senate, and got signed by the governor, but it has to start over and pass again in order for it to become law. And so that it will come into play in some of the in one of the proposed amendments for the 22nd, but then also there may have been some that passed and got signed with a reenactment clause. So most bills will go into effect July 1st, unless there was an emergency clause, which means it could go into effect sooner, or a delayed enactment clause, which means it may take a little bit longer than July 1st, and then a reenactment clause means that it has to be passed by the General Assembly again in order to become law. So it's really, really important, especially the news is doing a great job of covering a lot of the bills, but what's super important is to say, okay, that sounds like a great idea, but you don't want to go living your life like this is a new law if it didn't go into effect July 1st of this year. And one of those is like the minimum wage, the raise in minimum wage. So we'll talk about that because there's an amendment on there. But some of these elections bills, like the total automatic voter registration, that's not for this year. There's a smaller version of automatic voter registration, but it's really, really important when you're hearing about these sweeping changes to know when they come into effect. And so we will try to say, whenever we say something is going to affect, when it will be. But yeah, so that's really important to look at lis.virginia.gov. And then you can look that up. So some of the new bills that we have that will become law July 1st. First is the Virginia Values Act. And a lot of folks are talking about this because it's pretty historic and pretty progressive, especially for a Southern state. But this is a bill that allows for the LGBTQIA community to operate like anyone else. And that is, discrimination is not okay in the workplace and housing. Right now, before July 1st, it is totally legal to have a gay couple come see a house and say, well, actually, we're not going to sell this to you or show this to you, or you can't live here because of who you are. That is absolutely legal right now. Well, after July 1st, it will no longer be so. And the good thing about, I think they said something like, I think there's a saying like, rising tides float all boats. One of the wonderful things too about this is while we're giving these same protections to the LGBTQIA community, we also improved some of the protections for all of the protected classes. And so even those protections that are given based off of race, those got improved as well. And so it'll be really, really cool for you to read the specifics, and that's in Senate Bill 868. Shout out to Delegate Mark Sickles, because he worked his butt off for this, and unfortunately there were some games in the end, and so it wasn't the House bill that got passed, but the Senate Bill 868 did get passed. So when you go to lis.virginia.gov and you type in for bills and resolutions, SB 868, you can go and read that yourself to see what the words are, and it's really pretty cool. It was great to be a part of us getting to a place where we are no longer legally able to discriminate against people for things like services in public, housing, and in the job. Again, just right now, it is legally, you can legally fire someone for who they love, and so we're removing that. So then there are some parts of the law that are really old, and not as old as some people think, because there's some folks that say, you know, like racism is over, that was back in the day. But there were bills that were passed previously where the language was still on the books that was just archaic and ridiculous, to include the establishment of the poll taxes. There was one that I worked on, House Bill 1086, where we were removing the language that basically said when people voted or they turned in information to the like the registrar, or what we would have for the registrar, like Black folks got a different color paper, and when they turned it in, it was kept separate from, you know, white folks' ballots and white folks' poll tax information. So we stripped that out. Now, we did pass federal changes, and we had changes in the Constitution that had already made it illegal, but and a symbolic gesture of cleaning up the code, it helps us as we're moving forward to remember to not go back and to not reenact policies that make it harder for people to navigate society based solely off their race, their gender, or them being different than the people that wrote these bills originally. And so, you know, people are telling me it was so long ago. Well, some of the provisions that got taken out with House Bill 1086 were actually put into place in 1951. So I noticed some names on this call, and so think about that. Some of the people that are here participating in this conference call right now were born when those provisions were put in. So we can't act like it was that long ago, but now we can't act like it's gone from the code, because it is. And shout out to the folks that were working on removing racist language about, like, even on deeds, saying like, hey, if you're not white, you can't buy your house here. Even in like current time, even though it's outdated, it's unconstitutional, they were still legally made to sign these forms that were just ridiculous. And so we worked on that. And then we have some bills with criminal justice reform. And when Delegate Lindsay comes back, we can talk about the Fishback bill. But really, we're talking about things that like raise the felony larceny threshold. And so last year we had raised it from $250 to $500, and then this year we raised it to $1,000. And so we are definitely celebrating that as we're working to fight against mass incarceration, but just also know that I think it was Texas that has one that's $2,500. So we're not the most progressive on that, but we have definitely come a long way from the $250. Then there's the requirement, we had talked about this last year, but it's even more formalized now, that if your license was revoked because of your failure to pay fees and fines, that will no longer happen, just so it wasn't a traffic or it wasn't a violation with regard to your operating a motor vehicle. And so if you got popped for a simple possession and you lost your license because of fees and fines, and that will no longer happen. Your ability to pay your fees and fines would not determine whether or not you can get your driver's license. Another one is the age at which a juvenile can be tried as an adult, and that got raised from 14 to 16. So I know for some of us, we were working for that to be 18, but that is a step in the right direction. And then there's several more if you look up. One of the ones that I was really proud to have worked on was House Bill 277. And basically current code says that there are these ways that you can do community service if you have been incarcerated. So if you did community service prior to incarceration or after incarceration, then it can count to coming off of your fees and fines. So literally applying your community service to the debt that you could incur with your fees and your fines. Well, we passed the bill that said that we're going to add in during. And so now, and on July 1st, because this bill was already signed, community service done prior to, during, or after incarceration can count towards removing those fees and fines. And what was really interesting too about the collaboration, this was a bipartisan bill. I got the idea from my sheriff, Gabe Morgan in Newport News, and other folks were working on it as well too, and to include Delegate Terry Kilgore, who we may not agree on a lot, but we did work together across the aisle on this. And we also added, with the help of our legislative staff, more code sections that would define what's available to be community service. So it's with nonprofits. It might be if the jail has like a reentry program and people, or a prevention program, some of the folks might be able to come out and go speak to, say, teams that you might want to kind of have a different trajectory. Them going to talk to those teams with a nonprofit could now suffice for that, and they could get credit for that against their fees and fines. And the rationale is not only the fact that if you're doing it before or after incarceration, it should also count for during, but also helping to work off that debt such that when folks do come back into the community, they can come back and really work on getting back into the community, and less debt is helpful for that. So there's lots of other bills that are really helpful in moving the needle forward on criminal justice reform, but you can also go to lis.virginia.gov and look up a ton more. And then, if you came to hear about decriminalization of marijuana, we'll get to that, but that's not 100% done yet. There is an amendment that we'll be dealing with on Wednesday. So then voting access. So Virginia has been written up in a lot of national publications as really, really moving super forward on voting rights. And this is something that's near and dear to my heart. So when about the early 2000s to mid 2000s to end into the first, the whole first decade of the 2000s was really it was a pretty dark time when it came to certain groups really pushing forward this anti-access agenda. And so you saw that Virginia's legislature, along with many, many other across the country, were passing obstacles, bills that would add obstacles to getting to the ballot box. And so you had photo ID, you had places that were closing polls in African-American neighborhoods and making people like really travel across the city. You had folks that were drawing districts that were just not fair. They were completely gerrymandered, but you had a lot of this concerted and purposeful and directive effort to making sure that it was harder for some of us to get to the ballot than others. And this year, we really undid a lot of them that were done in Virginia. And so I just wanted to run down a few. First, we have House Bill 1, which would allow the early voting process to occur without an excuse. So right now, a lot of folks that come into Virginia are baffled when they're like, wait, y'all don't have early voting. Well, we really didn't. We had absentee voting. But as you all know, and as you're looking at the absentee applications now, you have to have a stated excuse. And some of them even ask for documentation, even though that hasn't been really enforced, but you have to have an excuse in order to vote early. And so that has been changed. And as of July 1st, you will no longer have to have an excuse. You will still apply to get your absentee ballot, but you'll no longer have an excuse. And speaking of the application, as it stands right now, you can get on a list that that includes you as like needing an absentee ballot, but one of the bills is making it super easy for you to just fill it out once, and then no matter what election is coming up, you will get an absentee ballot for that. And so like my 101-year-old grandma, it'll be great to just sign her up once, so that she can stay within the comfort of her home and still exercise her right to vote. But it'll come to her by mail if the family should choose to fill this out. And then eventually we will have a permanent absentee list, which you wouldn't have to renew it every year. It would just be in place until you said that you didn't want it any longer. And so that's going to be super helpful for like college kids. Like when I went away to Atlanta for college, I did not feel like I had moved to Atlanta. I felt like I still lived in Virginia. I was just away for college. So I could be on that for 4 years for all of the ballots. And then when I come home to Virginia, I could take myself off. So that's going to be really, really helpful to getting people better access to the absentee voting process. Right now, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about local elections, but right now, if you are filling out an absentee ballot for a local election for what is currently scheduled for the May 5th election, you can use excuse 2A, which also says my disability or illness, in order to get your absentee ballot for this current pandemic, so that you don't have to go out and vote. You can vote from home, even if you're not currently sick and that you don't have any disability or illness, you can still use it. 2A, if you're applying online, it's the 7th choice from the top, and it says my disability or illness. There was also a bill to expand the amount of time that people have to get their ballot back. And so a lot of folks get to like walk into their polls, they vote, then they leave, and it's super easy. But some folks don't have it like that. Like, so for instance, they might show up and they forgot their ID or don't have an ID and didn't know that the registrar gives out free ID. So they vote by provisional ballot. And so they might walk in on a Tuesday, they vote by a provisional ballot. That is then held to the side. They have until Friday of that same week to come back and prove they are who they are with the proper ID. And then their vote will then count. Well, this would move back the date for when your absentee ballot has to be in to that Friday as well. Since no voting election ballots are being certified or election results are being certified prior to that anyway, then it would make sense to give folks a little bit extra time to get their ballot back. That's super helpful for folks that are overseas. It's also helpful for those of us that may have been used to a 1-day or 2-day turnaround for local mail, but it's not like that anymore. And that's not a knock on our U.S. Postal Service folks. Love them. Hope that we do fund them. And if you can, buy some stamps to show your support. But it just is the reality that we don't have that quick of a turnaround. And so people might come up a little short when getting it back. So if we do have an election prior to July 1st, you still need to get it in by 7 p.m. on election day. But that change is coming. And then also one of my favorite ones is it's being touted as the repeal of the voter ID law. That is not the case. It is the repeal of the photo ID requirement. And so if some of you all will remember, prior to photo ID becoming law, we could take our electric bill, we could take an ID that may not have had the photo up there, but there were all kinds of, your voter registration card. That's what I took to vote the first time that I voted when I turned 18. And so there are all these kinds of things that you can use in order to show your identification. So you still have to identify yourself. You still have to be on the voting rolls in order to vote. So you still want to make sure that you're registered, that the proper information is in there. But instead of having to have a specific photo ID, there are all of these different ways that you can identify yourself. So love that, because that really does make it a lot easier. And if you say, well, why don't they just go get a driver's license? Then that means that you don't fully understand the privilege that you have with the driver's license that you're walking around with. And then this just makes it easier for those that may not have time to take off and go to DMV and may not have time to do things, but they get that voter card in the mail to them and they'll be able to use that. Yeah, we had a lot of bills, y'all. So, automatic voter registration. Okay, so I talked about that there's going to be this like bigger automatic voter registration. So one day when you turn 18, you will be entered into the list to be registered to vote. And then you'll be able to opt out. And so there are some religious organizations that do not believe in being registered to vote. So they would be able to opt out, but everybody else turn 18, you get put into the pot for voter registration, automatic. Well, that's not what is becoming law on July 1st. What is becoming law is, should you go to the DMV, then that triggers, if you're not registered to vote, that you would then be registered to vote. And I asked questions during committee. Does that mean like if I move here from a new state and I'm coming to get my driver's license, that counts? If you're coming to get your driver's license and you're 18, that counts. But if you are 18 and older and you don't opt out, but you do visit the DMV, then starting July 1st, you will be able to be registered to vote. And so I just want to make sure that I'm correct and take my own advice and read to make sure that that enactment date is this year, because there was lots of talk about pushing that back. And yep, so that's this year. And then there's some other bills that will be coming into effect a little bit later. There's like the, let me see, oh, the holiday. So voting, election day has been changed to be the holiday in exchange for the Lee Jackson holiday. So we'll get election day as our holiday in exchange for that. So that's pretty cool. It's a holiday in order to vote. So that'll help those of us that are trying to figure out, like, especially folks that live across, you know, they live across a bridge and where they work. So I don't know how y'all do it, but folks at Newport News that are working in Virginia Beach or what have you, you don't have to worry about your traffic patterns for that day if you have a job that allows for you to take those state holidays. So doesn't help everybody, because if you're not, you know, a person that gets holidays and you still are scheduled to work, you have to show up, but it helps some. So that's voting access. Again, there are even others that I didn't touch, but lots and lots of great things happening in the round of voting. So one of the more contentious issues that came up, as you'll remember, lots of folks showing up in Richmond to have their voice heard, whether it was Martin Luther King Day or any other day. I serve on the Public Safety Committee and on the Firearms Subcommittee, and every single time that we met, the room was full with whichever side of the issue folks were on. But we were able to pass 5 major pieces of legislation to include reinstating the 1 gun a month law, instating the emergency risk protective orders, which means that there is an opportunity to separate someone from their firearm for a temporary time if they should be a danger to themselves or to others. Then there was the required 48 hours. So if your gun is lost or stolen, then you need to report it within 48 hours of your realizing that it was lost or stolen. Then there was the universal background check. So I know a lot of folks understand that when you could go into these gun shows or what have you, that you didn't have to have your background check, but now we are a step closer to everywhere that you purchase a gun, you would have to undergo that background check. And then the 5th one is, so it was already illegal for you to recklessly leave your firearm around the presence of a minor, but we did increase the penalty for that. And this is not about hunting. This isn't about teaching your kid how to use a firearm. This is recklessly leaving a loaded firearm within the reach of a child. And so we have seen the news, and we've seen way too many kids just have access to loaded firearms that were not trained and did not understand that it wasn't a toy, and either kill themselves, a family member, or a friend. And those tragedies can be 100% prevented. And so this is just incentive for folks to do that. And then there were 2 more bills within the governor's package that will come back up for reconvened. And then I'll talk about those. But so far, 5 have been signed into law and will go into effect July 1st. There are others to include right now. It is legal for you to get your concealed carry permit by taking an instructional course online. in order to get your concealed carry permit. So that is being changed to it now having to be in person, which I think makes a lot of sense. You can't take your driver's license requirements online when it comes to the behind the wheel portion. And so it's really showing up, getting trained in person, making sure that you are someone that needs this or can use this concealed carry permit in an in-person way. So that is gun safety. I'm gonna pause here. Tempest, do we have any questions yet? Okay, cool. I will keep it moving. Don't forget that you can use that chat feature here on the Zoom. If you should want to ask a private question, you can send it to Tempest, or you can send it to everyone, or if you have a question, comment, or something that I have said, you can send that to me. And then Virginia is now, I mean, just one of the most progressive, again, for the South, clean energy bills. And so we had the Virginia Clean Economy Act, Virginia Clean Economy Act that we passed that addressed our getting off of fossil fuels. It addressed our reducing our carbon footprint. It addressed how we're going to get there with clean energy, renewable energy, and really opened up a lot for the market for, say, wind and solar. And that's really important for those of us in Hampton Roads, because some of the provisions within there will open this to a whole new world with the potential for wind. And then I think out west was a little excited about where they might be able to do solar. One of the things that we do want to make sure that as we're implementing this is to make sure that there's equal access to opportunity. And so there is a provision in there that says that within Hampton Roads that they will prioritize folks that are applying for some of these new jobs locally. So then we need to take another step back and make sure that people are being trained properly so that they can apply for these jobs. But this is a new wave for the future that we're going to move into, and making sure that we are reducing our carbon footprint and leaving hopefully a better and healthier world to the next generations. But we have a lot of cleanup that we need to do first. And there are also some environmental justice implications in this as well, so that those that live in poor and minority communities aren't being the ones that are targeted for some of the energy that isn't clean. And so that's really cool. And you can read more about that and the work that was done for that. Then there's also the Clean Energy and Community Flood Preparedness Act. And so those of us here in Hampton Roads, we know about recurrent flooding. If I say, where does it flood when it rains on a regular day? Some of us can pop up, you know, in Hampton, Newport News, and just think of either apartment complexes or streets. When you know it's raining, you don't go there. Well, in addition to Norfolk and just Hampton Roads, protecting the shipyards and the Navy, and, you know, instead of moving on this trajectory where it's just normal, why don't we do things to prevent it or to mitigate it? And so that's what House Bill 981 does. And so there are some other pretty cool environmental bills. If you heard a lot of conversation, some of the negotiations of us trying to get to this bill were to make sure that Dominion Energy stands to make a lot of money off of these new provisions. And we wanted to make sure that while we're moving in the right, those of us that voted like I did, wanted to make sure that while we're moving in the right direction, that it's not on your backs to pay for all of this as the ratepayer. And so there were a lot of discussions. This bill really went down to the wire to the end of session because some of the more progressive members wanted to just fight back and make sure that, yes, we do need these things, but it should not be on the backs of people that are already struggling to pay their bills. And so we got to a pretty okay compromise. I think we still have some work to do as it pertains to putting the limits on some of this for it to be on the backs of the ratepayer. There was also a environmental justice council that was further codified and established. And so there'll be ways for people to talk about justice within and the environmental community as well. Don't forget to ask any questions as you have them. But then as we come to economic justice, This is really important, and a lot of things that I have been working on. In the Labor Day of 2018, I wrote an op-ed in the Daily Press about an Oxfam report that rated Virginia 51st out of the states and DC for where to work, best places to work. So Virginia had also gotten the best state for businesses and then the worst state for workers. And then a lot of us just felt like we could be the best state for businesses and the best state for workers, but we got to get those two groups intentionally working together and really taking steps in order to make sure that as we're potentially giving business incentives for new businesses to come here, we also send a message, but if you come to do business here in Virginia, you are going to take care of Virginians. And I think this year we sent that message loud and clear as we put into place protections against misclassification. I was happy to work with Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy and the Domestic Care and Action that works with domestic workers to make sure that we are making it illegal if someone skims off the top of somebody's wages or actually outright doesn't pay them. Wage theft should be illegal, yes. And then also, if I file a complaint for you doing this to me, it should be illegal for you to fire me or discriminate against me in retaliation for me putting that complaint in. And we were able to do that. We were also able to expand the investigative powers. So let's say if Tempest and I were working for someone and they were investigating my claim that my wages had been stolen. And while they were doing that, they saw that Tempest's wages had also been stolen. Tempest doesn't have to go through the bureaucratic process of putting in a complaint in order to trigger an investigation of her own. Because we work for the same entity, that would already get investigated. And so that's pretty cool. It helps deter employers from wage theft, but also gives the worker a little bit more protection to be able to keep their job, because it's like, wait, you don't get to steal from me and then fire me for saying, hey, don't steal from me, right? So that is super helpful. And then with the misclassification, so if you're a true employee, but I'm making you be someone that has to work with a 1099 instead of a W-2 so that I don't have to give you benefits, that's not fair. And so misclassifying people as a contractor when they're actually an employer, that has been worked on as well. And then a lot of workplace discrimination for pregnant women and women that so that people that are pregnant are not getting discriminated against. Yeah, someone that's about to have a baby is probably going to take some time off, but that doesn't mean fire them right before they take the time off so that they then don't have a job while they're doing something that's a pretty natural part of life. Let's see. Man, there's like a lot for this, so I'll let you all look up some of those, and we'll dive even more into them. There, Delegate Don Scott did one for protecting against discrimination within apprenticeship programs. So it's like the amount of legislation that was passed in this is a little jarring, because every single one of these bills, there are stories and experiences that match up to it. So I wish we didn't need that many bills, but because of the ways that, you know, people were being mistreated, we were able to put forward a lot of these bills in order to make their workplace better. So again, we're trying to get to Virginia being the best for business, but also the best for the workers that really make the money for that business. And I think that these protections are going to be, I mean, just super pivotal, because you can imagine the type of exploitation that can pop up during this international pandemic when people are just strapped for cash. And so we want to make sure that people are not being exploited and taken advantage of. Businesses can thrive and also be good to their people. And so we really want to continue to put that message forward. So that's just a little taste of the 1,200 and something bills that were passed. It was a busy session. It was, I mean, just like, it was a lot, but okay. It was covering women who are pregnant. We'll also cover women who plan on adoption as well. So we are in the process. So I think this bill, thank you for the question. I think this bill was specific against pregnancy retaliation or discrimination. But within some of the conversations that we've had there to include not having discrimination against people who are breastfeeding, so giving them somewhere to go so that they can take care of that. But then also this idea of just paid time off, such that if it's medical leave, or if it's maternity or paternity leave, or just paid time off in general, we're having those larger conversations. So if it's someone that wants to adopt, of course they need time to be at home, to bond, whether it's a baby or a teenager. You just need to be home and making sure that those relationships are getting fully formed. That is part of conversations that we are having to make sure that the family unit is as strong as possible, whatever that family unit should look like, but really allowing for people to be human beings and parts of their family, in addition to being workers and not being treated as these replaceable robots. So, so really good question. We're still working on a lot of that. I think the foster care and adoption scenarios could take a little bit more attention, but it's on the radar. I think we just had to take this like first bite at the apple, and then we have the second year of this term, and then however many years more we need to work to get it right. So thank you for that question. So then moving to April 22nd. So within the way the legislative process works, so we were in Richmond, January, February, March, passed all the bills, and then every single bill that passed the House and the Senate went to the governor. The governor has 4 options. The governor could sign it. The governor could veto it, meaning he or she does not want it to become law. The governor can send down a proposed amendment or change to the bill, and then the governor could take no action, and then within the no action, the bill would become law July 1st. So it's very rare for the governor to take no action, and I don't think we had any of those this year, but those are the 4 options that any governor has. And so now I just went over the bills that have been signed that are gonna become law on July 1st, or a little before, a little after, or have to go back through the process, right? So, gosh, this is so confusing sometimes, but stick with me. For those that were vetoed or had amendments that were added to it, that's what the General Assembly will be taking up on April 22nd. And so to be very clear, because we've had all kinds of requests, well, why don't y'all do this? Well, why don't y'all do that? Well, why don't y'all do this? When we go on April 22nd, we cannot introduce new legislation. This is legislation that has already been passed and approved by the General Assembly, and the only actions we can take are in response, up or down vote, a yes or no, to the governor's actions. So those vetoes and amendments. So let's say, for instance, y'all are like, hey, why don't we do this in response to COVID, the COVID epidemic? If there was not a bill already in there or a way to do it through budget language, then it's not something that we can do. And a lot of the great ideas that people are having or seeing other states do, they would take an all new completely bill. The bill would have to go through the committee structure, and then it would have to be passed by the House and the Senate, and then it would have to be signed by the president. That would take a special session, which is coming up a little later in the year once I talk about the budget, but there is a difference between a special session and a reconvened session. This reconvened session happens every single year. It's a regularly scheduled session, and the only thing that we can do is answer to the governor's actions for vetoes and amendments. So this year, the governor has done 1 veto, and it was for a bill that would define milk as the substance or secretion from a hooved animal. There was some talk that this was the attempt for the dairy industry to kind of monopolize what could be called milk. And so did pass the House and the Senate, but it was vetoed from the governor with concerns that this might be against the corporation's right to free speech or right to be able to label their product. Also, I don't know that it's confusing. Like personally, I do not drink a lot of cow's milk, but I drink soy milk. I was not confused that soy milk is different from cow's milk. And so I don't know that this legislation was needed. So that veto I do plan to support. And then if there's anybody that wants to do maybe a better PR job, you can stick a picture of a cow on it. Like there are lots and lots of ways that you can say, okay, this is different from that. But oat milk, almond milk, it would have had to been like almond juice or, you know, almond beverage or whatever, when it's already in a separate section in the grocery stores that I go to. So I don't know that there was a lot of confusion or that this bill was needed, but that was the one veto that we got out of like a little bit more than 1,200 bills. But we do have a ton of amendments. And so if you go to that website that I told you about, lis.virginia.gov, then you would go to click on bills and resolutions. And then there's a section that says governor. And there's governor's recommendations that have been adopted, approved or enacted, vetoed, and acts of assembly chapters. The governor's recommendations are the changes that the governor is recommending to the bills that have already been passed by the House and the Senate. The governor's recommendations adopted show you some of the bills that we already voted on the governor's amendments while we were still in session. So even though we have not gone back for veto session or reconvened session yet, there are 6 that we already voted on. And so I don't want that to confuse people. There are already 6 up there that you can read. So when you go to the governor's recommendations, you can click on the budget number. You can click on the bill number and you can see what the proposed change is. And then you can line it up with, okay, this is what the original bill did. This is what the proposed change did. There are a lot of them that are just clean up in language where it was, we said it like this, but we should have said it like that, but no real changes to the substance. And then there are some that are quite substantial. So we'll go through a few of those, but the logistics of April 22nd are still kind of in the air. As you can imagine, as I sit here before you right now, it is a little intimidating to know that I'm about to go be around 99 other people in the House of Delegates during an international pandemic, but this is necessary because unfortunately we did not have any emergency provisions for us to handle this session electronically. Now, Speaker Fillercorn has been putting forward some ideas with the leadership of the House. She's the leadership of the House and then the leadership of the Senate. And there are discussions, and I've already been trained on the software we would use should we have an approval to use electronic means. I am super hopeful that that's what it is. So there's been some conversation like, once you get around someone, if you have it, you've exposed them. So it doesn't matter how long you're around them. So I've checked in with some folks, Speaker Fillercorn checked in with some folks, and that's absolutely false. Like the longer you're around someone, the more chances there are that you might catch something if they have it. So think about me. Think I've done pretty well today, but it's because I'm being super intentional. But imagine I can go 30 minutes without touching my face. Can I go 4 or 5 hours without touching my face? It is hard, y'all. And so we will have on masks to help us keep from touching our face. But remember, those cloth masks and the masks that are not the N95 are not guaranteed to prevent it. And, you know, shout out to Dolores McQuinn, the delegate from Richmond City, who is getting better, but she did experience COVID-19, and she has an interview talking about how hard it was that she came through it. So there's a lot still in discussion about what it will look like on the 22nd. Want to throw this in as well. There's been some Facebook talk about having protesters come out on the 22nd. And here's what I know, 10 or fewer people are in neither one of those situations. And so I have more plans for this year. I wasn't trying to really put myself out there. Tempest is staying home and will be in Newport News helping me by phone and email. But and then I'll also be self-quarantining for 14 days once I come home, because I don't want to put my family at risk from this either. So my real takeaways for you all are: continue doing what you're doing. And even if you see 100 people sitting together, know that we all know that this was a bad idea. We just didn't have a legislative option around it. Hopefully we will be there for a very brief time, just to approve for us to be able to then have another meeting on Thursday to be able to take up the meat of the amendments. There are several amendments, and I have thoughts and feelings on a lot of them, and I know I'm not alone. So if you imagine we have 180 amendments, and if we just take 3 minutes on each one, we're already well into the being around each other for too long. So the House members, we are going to be on the grassy area surrounding the Capitol. And then the Senate members are going to be at an event space at a local museum in Richmond. And so I do hope that for the sake of 140 families, 140 staffs, we're talking like, how many of us statistically either are on the high risk list or live with someone on the high risk list. We really need to make sure that we're taking every single precaution in order to keep our people and ourselves safe, and also model the proper behavior. If we're asking y'all to stay home, I mean, really, you know, we gotta make sure that we're doing there. But the work is also important. And if we don't pass the amendments to the budget, that's bad too. So, so those logistics are still unfolding. So you guys can stay tuned. We'll have more info on our website, and I'm sure the news will probably cover it as well. But on the day of, no matter what it looks like, whether it's electronic or in person, there will be live streaming. So that will be covered either way. And there will also be ways for the press to be there in limited number if we're there in person as well. I've had some folks reach out to me and ask me about my safety, not only for the virus, but because y'all's president decided to kind of try and stir up some things on Twitter the other day. I do have a gun bill, and I am looking forward to passing the amendment so that it becomes law, but I'm also taking precautions to keep myself safe on that as well. So let's jump into a few of these amendments. And again, the creativity that it took for the legislative and executive branches to work together to find ways to amend bills for new situations. Remember, we closed out our session by voting on the budget on March 12th. The world has changed since then. And so some of these ideas were very limited in scope because we didn't have this pandemic in mind. So House Bill 340 is a bill that you all have heard me talk about, where it would allow people who are federally employed, if there should be a furlough, then this gives them a 60-day extension prior to an unlawful detainer being taken out on them for their inability to pay their rent, and a 30-day for inability to pay their mortgage. And so with the federal furlough, you all know it's not their fault that the government shut down because of negotiations that may have gone wrong on the federal level. So this would allow for them to have more time to pay their rent back so that they don't get evicted because of a federal shutdown. Well, I worked with the good folks in the executive branch, and there have been amendments to allow for this 60 days and these 30 days to apply to people who have been impacted by COVID-19. There are some stipulations. So this would be for people who are the landlords that have not gotten federal loans in order to cover their mortgages. And this would not be for people that have gotten their unemployment benefits, such that the idea behind that is if you're getting a replacement for your income, then you should be paying your bills. So go on and use that money for the rent. But if you're not eligible for unemployment and you're not getting these types of things, minus the stimulus check, that doesn't count. But if you're not getting regular unemployment benefits, that this would allow for you to have that extra time to keep you from being evicted. Right now, mostly you're not seeing a lot of the evictions, not because it's illegal to evict people during a pandemic or because they get more time, why HB 340's amendment is needed. It's because the Supreme Court has shut down the courts to anything that's not considered an emergency, and evictions are not within the definition of emergency. As of right now, the Supreme Court has not extended that from the April 26th deadline. So they may very well extend that, but as of right now, on April 27th, anything that was in process prior to the shutdown or anything that could be brought up new would go into effect April 27th if that emergency order is not put into a further extended date. Now, there is an emergency clause on House Bill 340, so that would put this bill, should the amendment pass the House and the Senate, it would put it on the governor's desk, and as soon as the governor signs it, it would become law. And so that would be super helpful for those of us that may be struggling during this time to pay our rent. House Bill 421 is the bill, the gun bill that I'm carrying, that would allow for localities to be able to say whether or not guns and ammunition are allowed in their public buildings where they're doing business. And it would also allow for them to say yes or no to that, to permitted events. So say, for instance, one of the big events that we have in Newport News is Holly Dazzle. And even though it looks a little bit different than it used to, that's a permitted event. It's a public event. Even if it's not all held on public property, that would be susceptible to the city of Newport News being able to say no firearms are allowed within this event. It does require for any building or event that does not allow firearms to post it, so that someone that may have a firearm on them knows to take it back to a secure location. They're at the very, very last minute during the end of session. A senator came up with an amendment that would allow for VMI and institutions with ROTC to be excluded from their ability. So say, for instance, if the locality where this school is puts into an effect and no guns in public sort of deal, then in these public spaces, then they would be exempt. So in order to get the bill to the governor without taking the risk of going into conference, we got it passed. But this amendment would just simply clean up that language to say what types of organizations are exempt from it. And so I look forward to the House and the Senate doing that. And then another bill that I worked on was for redistricting. House Bill 1255 is a standalone redistricting criteria bill. So I know you all heard lots of conversation about who should draw the lines, but this answers the question is how the lines should be drawn, and it gives rules and guidelines that protect communities of color, communities of interest, and allow for us to really move forward with political and racial gerrymandering being illegal. It also adds something new for Virginia as well. Those two are huge, but this also adds ending prison gerrymandering. And this is the first time that it's gotten through in the Commonwealth. But in the bill, it states that we would have received, the people that are compiling census data would have received information on the addresses for those that are incarcerated by April. Well, March kind of threw us for a loop, so we're simply just moving the April deadline for these facilities to get this information to the Department of Legislative Services to August. That's it. That's it. That's the only amendment, and so we're really looking forward to that going forward. So those are some of the amendments that we'll be voting on, but the two that are the biggest are House Bill 29 and House Bill 30. Those are our two budget bills. So don't forget, the budget is just like any other bill or piece of legislation. It goes through the committee process, and it is an actual bill that you can see the language for. House Bill 29 is what's called the caboose budget. And so that's the end to get us through the end of June 30th of this year. And then House Bill 30 is when the new 2-year budget starting July 1st. That kind of answers a little bit of the questions as to why we can't move our tax filing deadline past June 30th, because we need that information to do our budget. But basically, we have significant impacts from COVID-19 on what it's going to look like for our budget. There have been estimates that we're going to lose $1 billion with a B, $1 billion for House Bill 29, and maybe $2 additional billion for House Bill 30. Where a lot of you might have interest is in the new spending that we passed and the new ideas and new initiatives that were for your locality or for education or for arts or for healthcare or for whatever. Those are usually in House Bill 30. So right now, a lot of the amendments that are coming to House Bill 30 are to press pause, not to say no, but to press pause, or get us to a point where some of these provisions would go into effect later than expected, because we just don't know the full extent to which COVID-19 and all of the radiating effects are going to impact the budget. So if we had a budget passed, and let's say, let's break it down to financing within our home. If you thought that you were getting $50,000 in for the month of July, and now you're just not sure, well, if your birthday is in July, you may not be having the same type of birthday that you thought you were, because your birthday party might look a little different. Well, think about that, but put that on billions of dollars. And that is just, I agree, it's the responsible thing for us to do, to wait to see the full impact of what this is going to do. We are getting in money from the federal government, but it will not plug all of the holes. And the localities are going to have to do this as well. They're in the middle of budget season, but a lot of the things that they're making decisions on, they have no idea like how this is really going to totally impact them. So keep that in mind as you're hearing local budget conversations as well. But across the board, across federal, state, and local, a lot of new spending is going to be halted, and a lot of the new and innovative work that we're doing might be postponed in an effort to just simply keep things running. The other part of that is some of the measures that a lot of us fought hard for. We feel them kind of slipping away, and I'll give you an example, and I'm being like super transparent. So the House Bill 395 for increasing the minimum wage, to me, was already a compromise. The House bill was a compromise. It got us to $15 an hour by 2025. It did remove some of the exemptions. So say, for instance, if you're a domestic worker, you're on a list of things that says in the code, you don't have to make minimum wage. If you worked for an organization or a company that had 1 to 4 members, if you worked for a family member, all these kinds of people that didn't still have to get minimum wage, right? So we took some of those folks off the list. So even more people would be eligible or mandated to be paid on minimum wage. But we took a stair-step approach that really took us to 2025 to get to $15. If you talk to some economists, $15 an hour in 2025 is not going to help a lot of the people that we would help if we got to it sooner. It's not getting people out of impoverished conditions if they're already there. But compromise, right? You got to get a bill out of both the House and the Senate. Well, the House and the Senate took drastically different positions. So even as I say, House Bill 395 was a compromise from what I wanted to see. And let me give you a little bit of my rationale on that. There are people, nobody can live off $7.25 an hour. Like, nobody, right? It's been proven. I think even in one of the new things, even for Newport News, if you wanted to live as a single person by yourself, in order to not be in poverty, you had to make about $13.10. So then you add on top of that kids and spouses and things. And so we're at this point where it's like, it's confirmed. Nobody can live off $7.25 an hour, be in their own dwelling place, and still be able to pay all of their bills. But we understand and heard from businesses that said, hey, going from $7.25 to $15 in 1 year, we would not be able to weather that storm. And so that's where you get the stair stepping. So you get in the House Bill 395, by January 1st, you would get to $9.50, which is still a movement in the right direction. So the Senate had this other stuff. We're not even going to talk about it. I just don't understand how they got to their bill, but they did. So then in the conference report, we came up with another compromise. And so that, again, that would have gotten us to $9.50 at the January 1st of 2021. So since the impacts of COVID-19 on the economy, businesses have really reached out to the governor and said, hey, we need you to push back this minimum wage because, you know, we've been impacted by these ways. Now, the recommendation within this bill is to push it back to May of 2021. So it would still be intact. The initial first increase to $9.50 would be pushed back to May 1st of 2021. But here's what I know. There's a lot happening within the national context. I know that I just read an article that millionaires are getting $1.7 million when they already have millions of dollars. Ruth's Chris, which I have only been treated to go to twice in my entire life, is getting $20 million, right? And so the SBA, the Small Business Association, has been giving out tons of money to businesses where these grants, if you use it for payroll and rent, if you do anything short of basically pocketing it, it becomes a grant that you don't have to pay back. So there have been all kinds of commercial real estate, mortgage, and all of that sort of stuff. I've seen lots and lots of that. When you put beside that some people will get $1,200 once, I am starting to just ask questions to, as we are taking care of the businesses, how can we also take care of the workers that help those businesses run? I know for a fact, if you have a hotel, you need a housekeeper, if not a full fleet of them. I know for a fact that if you have a restaurant, you need cooks and people that are doing the dishes. If you own retail, you need people that are selling your items. We are not in a fully automated society. These human beings are the reasons why businesses are still able to move forward. So I have a problem with pushing things back when I believe that in order to help the economy, you're going to have to help the people that help the economy run, not just the businesses. But this is, as a legislator, I don't get just to sit here and have feelings. I have to do a vote. And so I have to weigh out a vote. And as of right now, the scuttlebutt is that if we don't approve the move from January 1st to May 1st, that the governor could then outright veto it. So let me back up. A veto that is put down, that milk bill that's put down from the governor, has to be overridden by 2/3 of the vote in both chambers. So if we were just really, really, really emphatic that we wanted almond juice to be called almond milk to be called almond juice, 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate could come together and say, nope, we override this veto and cancel it out. If 1/3 plus 1 votes to sustain it in either house, the veto stands. Okay, so that's that one veto. Now, when we have recommendations or amendments, it has to be passed by the majority of the House and the majority of the Senate. So you're looking at 51 from the House, 21 from the Senate, because you have 100 members and 40 members. So 51 and 21 are the magic numbers for these amendments. If you have an amendment that receives the majority of both houses, then that bill with this new amendment goes back to the governor for signature, becomes law. No issue there. So House Bill 340 that we just went over, if everybody agree, well, if 51 and 21 agree that this should also apply to people that have been impacted by COVID, that goes back with the emergency clause, goes into law. If an amendment is rejected, meaning it does not get 51 and 21 votes, then it goes back to the governor. The governor can then either sign the original bill without the proposed change that he made, or he can veto the whole thing, and we do not have to approve that. So when it comes to House Bill 395, let me break it down. It's coming to us with an amendment. If we say yes to the amendment with 51 and 21, then it goes into law with the amendment. If it does not get the 51, does not get the 21. It goes back to the governor's desk where the governor can either sign it without the amendment or veto it. With the possibility of the bill for minimum wage increases to get completely vetoed, then I'm thinking, okay, if we have to start all over and try another minimum wage bill in January's session, by the time that goes through, if we could get another one through, because this one was contentious, then the soonest that that could probably go into effect is July 1st of 2021. So there's risk and also a later enactment date. So that leads me to believe that, feelings and thoughts aside, if I want this to happen, I need to support it in order for it to go into effect May 2021. That is not a good feeling, but it is what I feel is the best response to the bad situation I've been put in. Now, there are some bills that will not have a direct impact, and they're actually what's called permissive, meaning if a locality wants to do it, they can. If they don't want to do it, they can't. Those were put off as well. I'm not as forgiving on that, because if it goes into effect in January and you don't want to do it until May, then just don't do it until May. But if somebody wanted to do it in January, then they wouldn't have the opportunity if we push it back until May. So that's a different conversation. So there are a lot of these that are in House Bill 30 for these new bills that we have coming up, that it'll be an interesting conversation. And again, like I said, whether we are in person or we are online, it will be streamed. And so you will be able to see the conversation. I will try to speak clearly when I get up, because I'm not taking my mask off. But when I get up to speak, I will try to speak clearly. But there's some other recommendations that are coming into play as well. And I just want to make sure, just like with the other bills, if we're looking out for businesses and we're trying to be the best state for businesses, we have also got to be equally pushing for us to be the best state for workers as well. We cannot lose the ground that we've made up by repealing repressive code and also enacting progressive code. We can't let that go, but there might be some instances where we can put it off just a little bit. So stay tuned for that, but you can see all of this in the list under the governor's actions. Then after the 22nd, you can see even the ones that we adopted, and then approved or enacted are the bills that were passed and already have been signed by the April 11th deadline. And then acts of assembly chapters are when the bill kind of goes into the code format. So there were other things that I just talked about. And so now we get to the criminal justice as we're wrapping up. The criminal justice bill, House Bill 972 is the bill that would decriminalize simple possession of marijuana. I want to reiterate what I just said. There are lots of charges that surround around drugs and being intoxicated. House Bill 972 only changes simple possession. It does not change driving while intoxicated. It does not change, like, this is not saying you should like go in front of the police department and spark up. Like, this is not saying any of this. This is saying the singular charge of simple possession is being decriminalized, okay? So then it changes it from a criminal penalty that came with jail time, a possible jail time or a fine, to a penalty of $25. And it would be much like getting like a speeding ticket, and it would be sealed. The records would be sealed. So you pay your fee, you go on about your life. That's what decriminalization is. That's if you're an adult. There are different penalties if you are a minor. But reminder, simple possession has not gone into law yet. There is an amendment. So the amendment that the governor proposed is specific to the sealing of those records. If you get this charge, if a violation of this charge happens, a violation of this code section happens, and you're charged while operating a commercial vehicle, then it will be on your DMV record. So that's the amendment. I do sense that we'll be able to pass that. And so then once it's signed, July 1st, for simple possession of marijuana, it would be a civil penalty of the $25 as opposed to the criminal penalty. But we are not changing how the youth are impacted by this. So there, I saw a magazine article that says, governor decriminalizes marijuana. That's super misleading. A, because the bill is not final until it passes so say for instance, again, with this, if we pass the amendment and it goes to the governor, it becomes law. If we reject the amendment, the governor still has two choices: pass the original bill or veto it. So this is not a done deal, not a done deal. And so I just want to reiterate that. And also, if it was a done deal, does not go into effect until July 1st. You get popped with it June 30th, you get the current criminal charge, okay? And so we just want to make sure I am not proliferating any messages for or against. I just want my people to stay out of jail. So there, follow the laws, stay out of jail. So there is that. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them here in the chat feature. There was a lot of information, but let me tell you, we're gonna go even a little bit more in depth to like looking up the specifics of these provisions. So in the meantime, before we get to that, that one will be in May, because it's going to take us a little bit more time to get the response, well, the information back from all of the actions that we'll either be taking on the 22nd or very soon thereafter electronically. But we'll actually even pull up bills and say, okay, this italics, this is what is the new bill. This is what it means. This is how it will impact you. There's lots of things that will impact the Hampton Roads community, to include transportation funding, to include new commissions and organizations. I'll go back over some of my bills that we had. July will be Maternal Health Awareness Month. We worked on that bill. So lots of things that Tempest and I and the interns and assistants were able to get accomplished. We'll talk about more in depth, and then we'll also show you how to look it up, how to look at what it said before it passed and what the amendment does, but then also the implications for everyday life. So it's one thing to talk about, oops, I almost touched my face. It's one thing to talk about, you know, how a bill might do this or might do that, but say yes. Like there's one that says that the speeding limit could be increased to 85. That's not until July 1st. So please don't go 85 before that. So all those kinds of fun things that we'll talk about, and we'll put that date out. I do want to remind you that you can fill out your census online, by phone, or by paper. Right now, the national census response rate is, individual response rate is 50.5%. Virginia is at 55.7%. So we are beating the national average, but in Hampton, we're at 52.9%, and Newport News, we're at 51.7%. If you also hone in on this map and get to different neighborhoods, there are some neighborhoods that their individual response rate is at like 30%. Y'all, we cannot afford to leave any money on the table. If you fill out your census, for every person that is included in your census, you are gifting about $20,000 to your locality over the next 10 years to be used for the things that you need, like roads, healthcare, benefits, schools, disaster response. Right now, we are getting masks and ventilators based off population data from 2010. So be included in the count. That is really, really important. 2020census.gov. And then if you follow us on social media, you know that Delegate LaSharice Aird from the 63rd District in Petersburg and we have a lot of fun on social media. We're going to be going live on Facebook, talking a little bit more about what session is going to look like, because by the 21st, we'll know exactly what it's going to look like. Taking your questions and also adding a little bit of our flair to the discussion. We serve on a few of the same committees, but Delegate Aird is on the Appropriations Committee, so she will be talking about some of these budget changes, and I'll be going into more detail about some of the bills that I've worked on. So that's April 21st. We will be going on Facebook Live at 7 o'clock. And then also on April 27th, we're gonna do our second Zoom update. So much like you did today, you just log in, you can register at that link. We'll send this out to everybody that registered for today's conference. And so that will be an update to the update. So last time we talked to Congressman Scott, Mayor Price, we talked to Dr. Stephen Julian with the Peninsula District for the Health Department. We talked to folks from the Virginia Department of Education. We talked to Sanu at Transitions, Karen at the Food Bank, Tram at New Virginia Majority. So we talked to a bunch of folks, oh, and Centera. Well, a lot has changed since our original one earlier in March. So we want to do this update, giving a little bit more information. Right now we have confirmed Congressman Scott, I believe, Tempest, we have Mayor Price. We have someone coming from the Peninsula Health District with the Health Department. We also have State Superintendent James Lane with a few more guests. Oh, and Centera with the Centera Careplex President Kapua Conley, with the Vice President of Medical Affairs, Dr. Fisher. And we have some other invited guests, specifically hoping to get folks information on unemployment. Let me just say this. Other states' unemployment systems have crashed. Virginia's has not crashed, but they are very honest that they are still ramping up with more staff in order to get back to you sooner. So no one is saying it's perfect. Please keep trying. There are even people that were rejected earlier in March that would now be approved because of new federal legislation. So you may not get the Virginia dollars, but you might be eligible for the $600 from the federal. We'll talk about all that. We'll talk about small business loans, hearing that the well has dried up and what can small businesses do. Hearing from lots and lots of high school seniors about what it looks like to not have prom and graduation. We'll hear about that, but we'll also hear about the instructional opportunities that we have so that we don't have a huge achievement gap. Like, I promise I need y'all to keep these kids under some structure, and or else when we do get back to school, it's gonna be a little different, but also helping them keep their minds off the pandemic with a little bit of distraction with some of their schoolwork. Different districts are doing it different ways, but we'll talk about all of that. And then we'll hear from the hospitals. There's some new information about when the Hampton Roads peak might happen. So as folks are talking about, you know, opening back up, that is not what you will be hearing on my update. You will be hearing how important it is to base our decisions off science and data. And so, I'm sorry, one thing that I forgot within House Bill 30, Hampton and Newport News, and along with about 50 other localities, are scheduled to have a May 5th election. One of the amendments within House Bill 30 is for us to move that election to November. I have heard some pushback, but I'll tell you who I've heard pushback from. I've heard pushback from people who have a personal interest in the outcome of the election, i.e. candidates, and I've heard from people who are quite okay with voter suppression. I've also heard from Mrs. Michelle Obama, the ACLU, the Lawyers Committee for Voting Rights, and tons of articles that showed you the abysmal situation that we had in Wisconsin. I looked it up, and in 2018, we had 3.32% of people use absentee ballots for their May elections. So if we're saying that we want to move closer to 100%, that means we have significant resources and time that need to be put into teaching people how to use absentee ballots. There are people that have never used an absentee ballot, not meaning that they don't know stuff, they just never needed it. Like, I've never needed unemployment, so I didn't know how the system worked until I sat down and learned. So we cannot expect that people already know how to use absentee ballots. Even in 2016, for the presidential election, only 17.3% of all of all the votes that were cast by absentee ballot. So if we want to move to a safer mail system where more people can mail these ballots in, we need time to get to that. But also, when you're looking at we have UVA, we have University of, I just have a W, I think it was Washington. And then we have the Chime, like, these models are putting our peaks at May, June, or July. Why would we send thousands of people out into the streets when we're saying, please stay home? So I will be supporting the governor's recommendation to move those elections. You didn't have to tell me anything else other than we could do it to save lives. And then on top of that, you tell me it'll be after a lot of these new bills have been implemented. And so you wouldn't even need the excuse for the absentee ballot because that bill would have gone in. All of these things that we've been working on would be in place. But really and truly, if anyone is telling you that we should not move the election from May 5th, you should ask them, why not? And let them tell you why not, because the answer is we need to move them in order to keep people safe, keep people at home. There's a witness requirement for absentee ballots. If you live alone, then you got to go find somebody. The ACLU is suing on that to try and see if we can get rid of that witness requirement. We do want to have elections that have integrity, but we also want to keep our people alive. And I just can't see sending thousands of Virginians out into the election where they literally have to say, should I put my health, welfare, and my family at risk in order to exercise my right to vote? That should not be a decision that somebody has to make. You should be able to keep your health and vote, and that would give us more time. But the governor has already moved the June primary election to June 23rd-ish. Sorry, lots of notes. But yes, so that has been moved, and that is under his own decree. So you can only a location by direction of the governor can only move an election by 14 days, and then they could go to the courts to get it moved a total of 30 days. But it could not get moved any further without legislative action, and so that's what we are going to do. Some people were like, well, why don't you put it on this day or that day? And so it really is the best option to allow people to really participate. And so I get it. It's not a great thing that the ballots that would have already been cast would be destroyed, but those people would still have the opportunity to vote in November. Here's my caveat to the caveat. This is not final until the vote is taken on either April 22nd or April 23rd, depending upon when we take our votes in the House. And so if you can spare a stamp and you already have your ballot in hand, I would go on and vote and send it in. I actually did. I went on and voted and sent it in, because if we turn down this amendment, if it doesn't get to 51 and 21, then I'm not sure when the election would be, and it may be on May 5th. And so you don't want to have to really run and rush. Go on and get it in if you can get the witness signature, and if you can do without a stamp. So there's lots more information, but that is our time together today. Thank you all so much for joining me. If you have any further questions, you can email us at delmprice@house.virginia.gov, where we'll be taking more questions. And please register for the coronavirus update so you can hear it specifically straight from the experts. And then also on the 21st, you'll hear from Delegate Aird and me on Facebook Live. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Please stay home and save lives. What we're doing is working. We just got a little bit more time in order to get us out of the woods for coronavirus. Take care. Thank you. And thank you, Tempest. Bye.